The storm had rolled in fast, catching everyone in the city off guard. By the time the first rumble of thunder shook the sky, the streets had already emptied, leaving behind only the steady drumming of rain against pavement. The apartment building on the corner of East 47th Street stood dark and imposing, its facade battered by years of neglect. Liam tightened his hoodie as he stepped out onto his balcony. He had moved into the building only a month ago, still adjusting to its quirks, the creaking pipes, the flickering lights, and the strange, distant sounds that seemed to come from nowhere. Tonight, however, was different. As the wind howled and rain lashed the windows, the building itself seemed alive, groaning and shuddering with each clap of thunder. It was during one such rumble that Liam noticed it, a light on the 8th floor. The rest of the building had plunged into darkness after the power outage, but one window remained lit, casting a pale yellow glow into the rain-soaked night. "Must be a generator," he muttered to himself, though his chest tightened with unease. No one had mentioned anything about a backup power source, and he hadn't seen anyone enter or leave that apartment since he moved in. Curiosity got the better of him. Retrieving his binoculars from a dusty shelf, Liam focused on the lit window. The rain distorted the view, but he could make out the faint outline of a room, bare walls, a single chair, and a shadow. The shadow moved. Liam blinked, his breath catching. There was no one there. At least, not that he could see. Yet the shadow stretched across the floor, shifting slightly, as if someone, or something, was pacing back and forth. A crack of lightning illuminated the building for a split second. Liam's eyes widened. The shadow wasn't pacing. It was looking straight at him. The shadow lingered in Liam's mind long after he backed away from the balcony, his pulse pounding in his ears. He tried to shake the feeling, telling himself it was just a trick of the light. After all, the storm was raging, and the rain could easily distort what he thought he had seen. But the unease wouldn't leave him. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the streets slick and gleaming under a gray sky. Liam decided to casually ask about the apartment. In the lobby, he found Mrs. Carmichael, the building's self-appointed historian and gossip. She was perched in her usual spot by the mailboxes, her knit scarf draped over her shoulders. "Morning, Mrs. Carmichael," Liam began, keeping his tone light. "Do you know who lives in 8C? The one with the light on last night?" Her smile faltered. She glanced up from her crossword puzzle, her brows knitting together. 8C. "Oh, no one lives there, dear." "That can't be right," Liam replied, a nervous laugh slipping out. "I saw a light on last night. Looked like someone was moving around in there." Mrs. Carmichael's expression darkened, and her voice dropped to a near whisper. "That apartment's been empty for years." After the fire, she trailed off, shaking her head as if dismissing the thought. "Probably just the wiring acting up again. This place is old." But Liam wasn't convinced. He thanked her and headed for the elevator, her words looping in his mind. The fire? He hadn't heard about any fire when he moved in. Reaching the 8th floor, Liam hesitated in front of the apartment door. The paint was peeling, the number barely hanging by a rusted nail. He pressed his ear to the door, straining to hear anything beyond the thick wood. Nothing. Just as he was about to walk away, he noticed something unsettling. The faint scent of smoke lingered in the air, as if someone had recently lit a match. The scent of smoke followed Liam back to his apartment, clinging to his clothes and his thoughts. He tried to distract himself with TV and chores, but his mind kept drifting back to the door of 8C. It didn't make sense. How could a supposedly empty apartment still smell like fire? And what about the shadow he had seen? By the time night fell, the storm clouds had returned, heavy and oppressive. Rain began to patter against the windows again, and the uneasy atmosphere of the previous evening returned in full force. Liam decided he couldn't let it go. Grabbing his flashlight, he ventured back to the 8th floor. The hallway was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses on your ears. The peeling wallpaper and dim lighting gave the place an abandoned feel, even though the building was very much occupied. He stood in front of 8C, his hand hovering over the door. After a deep breath, he knocked. 3 sharp raps echoed down the hallway. He waited. No response. He knocked again, louder this time. The sound seemed to ripple through the air, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Still, nothing. Liam tried the knob, expecting it to be locked. To his surprise, it turned easily, the door creaking open just an inch. He froze, his heart pounding. "Hello?" he called, his voice trembling despite his attempt to sound firm. Silence. Pushing the door open wider, he shone his flashlight inside. The beam swept across bare walls and a wooden floor covered in a thin layer of dust. There were no signs of life, no furniture, no belongings, nothing. The room was entirely empty, save for a single chair in the center, its surface scorched and blackened as if it had been through a fire. As he stepped inside, the door creaked shut behind him. Then he heard it, the faint sound of footsteps. They weren't his. Liam froze, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The footsteps were faint but distinct, as if someone, or something, was pacing just beyond the edge of the dim beam. "Who's there?" he called, his voice tight with fear. The only response was the low groan of the storm outside. The footsteps stopped. Liam swept the flashlight around the room, finding nothing but the empty walls and the burnt chair. Still, the air felt charged, heavy, as though he wasn't truly alone. Backing toward the door, he stumbled over something on the floor. His flashlight caught a glint of metal, a small key, tarnished with age. He picked it up, turning it over in his hand. There was no label, no indication of what it unlocked, but the discovery felt deliberate, as if someone had left it there for him to find. Liam didn't want to stay another second. He bolted from the apartment, the door slamming shut behind him with a force that echoed down the hall. Back in his apartment, he tried to calm his nerves. He turned the key over in his fingers, its cold weight grounding him. What could it open? And why leave it in an apartment that was supposed to be empty? Determined to find answers, he dove into online records about the building. It didn't take long to uncover an article about the fire. A decade ago, a blaze had broken out on the 8th floor, devastating several apartments. The article mentioned a single fatality, a reclusive man who lived in 8C. Neighbors reported he was strange, rarely leaving his apartment and often complaining about shadows that moved on their own. Liam's stomach churned. The more he read, the more he felt a connection between the man's ramblings and what he had seen. The article mentioned that after the fire, the man's body had never been recovered, only his charred belongings. The storm outside intensified, thunder rumbling like an omen. Liam leaned back in his chair, the key still in his hand. A thought struck him, unwelcome but insistent: what if the man's spirit hadn't left? And what if it was waiting for someone to notice? Liam's grip on the key tightened as he climbed the stairs to the 8th floor. The storm raged outside, wind howling through cracks in the building. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the air itself resisted his movements. When he reached 8C, the hallway was shrouded in an unnatural darkness. The faint scent of smoke lingered, sharper than before. He slid the key into the lock, and it turned with a quiet click. Pushing the door open, Liam found the apartment as empty as he'd left it. The chair remained in the center of the room, its scorched wood a stark contrast to the pale walls. But something felt different. The silence was oppressive, as if the very walls were holding their breath. He stepped inside, the door creaking shut behind him. His flashlight swept across the space, but its beam seemed weaker, swallowed by the heavy darkness. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to pulse, almost alive. "Who are you?" Liam asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. At first, there was no response. Then, the faint sound of footsteps echoed through the room, but there was no one there. His flashlight flickered, plunging him into momentary darkness. When it steadied, the shadow was there, stretched across the floor and walls, its movements fluid and deliberate. Liam's breath hitched as the shadow began to take form, elongating and twisting unnaturally. It didn't resemble a human figure, it was something else entirely. "You shouldn't have come back," a voice rasped, low and resonant. It wasn't coming from any single point but seemed to vibrate through the air around him. Liam backed away, his heart hammering in his chest. "What do you want?" The shadow surged forward, enveloping the room. The cold was immediate and all-consuming, as though the heat had been sucked from his very body. Images flashed before his eyes, flames consuming the apartment, a man screaming as his silhouette burned into the walls, and then darkness. The shadow drew closer, its presence pressing against him like a physical weight. Desperate, Liam shouted, "Why are you here? What do you want from me?" The voice whispered again, softer this time but no less menacing, "You opened the door." The light of the flashlight dimmed to nothing, leaving Liam in total darkness. The air grew colder still, and he felt something brush against his shoulder, an icy touch that sent him scrambling backward. He collided with the chair, knocking it over with a deafening crash. The sound seemed to break the tension. The flashlight flared back to life, and the shadow retreated into the farthest corner of the room, melting into the walls like smoke. The silence returned, heavy and impenetrable. Liam didn't wait to see what would happen next. His legs carried him out of the apartment and down the stairs before his mind could catch up. He burst into his own apartment, slamming the door behind him, his chest heaving. But as he leaned against the door, catching his breath, a horrifying realization struck him: the key was still in his pocket. Liam sat on the floor of his apartment, back pressed against the door, the tarnished key clutched tightly in his hand. His thoughts raced, a tangled web of fear and disbelief. The storm rumbled on outside, lightning occasionally illuminating his darkened living room. He glanced at the key, its cold surface gleaming faintly in the dim light. He wanted to get rid of it, throw it as far away as possible, but something deep inside told him it wouldn't matter. Whatever had been in 8C wasn't bound by doors or walls. A soft sound broke the silence, a faint knock. It wasn't coming from his door. It was coming from inside the apartment. Liam froze, his eyes darting toward the hallway that led to his bedroom. Another knock, louder this time, echoed from the direction of the mirror in his room. He tried to tell himself it was just the storm, but his gut told him otherwise. Gathering what little courage he had left, he grabbed the flashlight and crept toward the bedroom. The air grew colder with every step, and the faint scent of smoke returned, stronger now. When he reached the doorway, he saw it, the mirror hanging on the far wall. The surface was fogged, as though someone had breathed on it. As he approached, words began to form in the condensation, scrawled by an unseen hand. "You let it in." Liam stumbled back, his heart racing. The flashlight flickered, the room plunging into darkness for a moment before the beam steadied again. Then he saw the shadow. It wasn't in the mirror this time. It was standing in the corner of his room, a figure so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it. It didn't move, but its presence was suffocating. "What do you want from me?" Liam demanded, his voice cracking. The figure tilted its head, as if considering his question. Then, it stepped forward. Each movement was deliberate, unnaturally fluid, and with every step, the room grew colder. Liam stumbled backward into the hallway, his flashlight trembling in his grip. "I didn't mean to." The lights in the apartment flickered violently, and the voice returned, louder and more resonant, filling every inch of the space. "You opened the door. Now it's yours." The figure stopped at the threshold of the hallway, its form flickering like a dying flame. It raised an arm, or something like an arm, and pointed directly at him. The walls seemed to close in, the air thickening until Liam could barely breathe. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow dissolved, leaving behind only the faint scent of smoke. Liam staggered back to the living room, his legs weak. The storm outside had begun to subside, but the stillness inside felt far more oppressive. He sank into the couch, the key still in his pocket, a reminder of what he had unleashed. And as he sat there, staring into the darkness, he noticed the faint outline of a shadow stretching across the floor. It wasn't his.